I've worked at Elmwood Library for 3 years now. It's a small old building tucked into a quiet corner of town, the kind of place people come to escape noise and lose themselves in books. The library has been here for decades, and it shows. Creaky wooden floors, dim lighting that flickers occasionally, and shelves so old they feel like they might collapse under the weight of the books they hold. It wasn't long after I started that I began hearing the rumors. Patrons would talk in hushed tones about how they sometimes felt like they weren't alone, even when the library was empty. Some said they'd felt a light brush against their arm or a cool breeze when there were no open windows. A few even swore they'd seen shadows moving between the shelves when no one else was around. I used to laugh it off. Old buildings are drafty and shadows can play tricks on the eyes. But over time, I began to notice things myself. It started small. A book would fall from the shelf when no one was nearby. It didn't seem like much at first. Books fall sometimes, right? But it happened often enough that it became hard to ignore. I'd hear the soft thud of a book hitting the ground, and when I'd go to check, it was always a book from the same shelf, the one near the back closest to the archive room. One evening, just as I was about to close up, I heard footsteps. I called out, thinking someone hadn't realized the library was closing, but no one answered. I walked the aisles, my keys jangling in my hand, but there was no one there. The sound stopped as soon as I stepped into the last row of shelves. Another time, I was shelving books near the archives when I felt it, someone watching me. It wasn't the casual glance of a passing patron. It was an intense, heavy feeling, like someone's gaze was boring into the back of my neck. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but the aisle was empty. The strangest thing happened just a few months ago. A woman came in looking pale and anxious. She asked if anyone had ever complained about the library being strange. I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated before explaining that every time she walked down the row near the archives, she felt like someone was whispering her name. She even said she heard it clearly once, a soft, raspy voice calling her. I didn't know what to say. Should I tell her I'd heard strange noises myself? That I sometimes thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye? Instead, I just smiled and told her the library was old and creaky, and maybe the acoustics played tricks on people. She didn't look convinced. Working late shifts is the worst. There's something about the library at night that makes it feel different. The air feels heavier, the shadows deeper. The silence, once comforting, becomes oppressive. I try to stay near the front desk where the lights are brighter and it feels less eerie. I've learned to live with it, though. Whatever's here doesn't seem malicious. It feels more like a quiet presence, as if the library has absorbed the energy of all the people who've passed through it over the years. Maybe it's just a trick of the mind, or maybe there's something more to it. I still hear the occasional thud of a book falling, and every so often a patron will mention feeling uneasy. I don't have any answers, and I'm not sure I want them. As long as the books stay on the shelves and the whispers stay faint, I think I can handle it. Besides, who's to say a haunted library isn't fitting in its own way? I've worked at our town library for years. It's a small place, the kind of library where you recognize most of the regulars and know which shelf. It was a Thursday evening at the library, the kind of night where everything felt stiller than usual. I worked the evening shift, and Thursdays were typically quiet. The regulars, mostly college students and retirees, had left by 7 p.m., leaving only a few scattered patrons in the study area. The library always felt different after dark. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the usual hum of the day gave way to an eerie stillness that made every sound seem amplified. Around 8 p.m., a man walked in. I hadn't seen him before, and something about him caught my attention. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, wiry build, wearing a gray jacket and scuffed boots, but the way he moved was deliberate. He didn't head straight to the shelves or the study area like most people. Instead, he lingered near the entrance for a moment before walking slowly toward the circulation desk, glancing at the ceiling and shelves as if he was taking in the entire room. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, trying to sound welcoming but also curious. He nodded, but his response felt strange. "Just looking around. This place has some history, doesn't it?" The question made me pause. Most people didn't strike up conversations about the library's history unless they were researching something specific. "Yeah, it's been here since the 60s, I replied, keeping it simple. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Ever hear the stories about the weird things that happen here?" I shrugged. "People say things. It's an old building, settling noises, drafts, books fall sometimes. It's nothing unusual." He didn't look convinced. "Books don't just fall for no reason," he said quietly, leaning on the counter. "I've been in a lot of libraries, seen a lot of places people say are strange, but this one feels different." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and let the silence hang. After a moment, he wandered off toward the nonfiction section. I tried to focus on checking in returns and updating overdue notices, but I couldn't stop glancing in his direction. He wasn't browsing like a normal patron. Instead, he moved slowly along the shelves, running his fingers over the spines of the books. Occasionally, he would stop, tilt his head, and move on as though searching for something specific but not quite finding it. The library was dead silent, so quiet that when a book hit the floor on the far side of the room, I nearly jumped out of my chair. It wasn't uncommon for books to fall, especially in the older sections where the shelves leaned slightly, but the timing unnerved me. The man didn't seem startled. He didn't even glance toward me to acknowledge the noise. Instead, he calmly walked over, picked up the book, and placed it back on the shelf. I couldn't help but notice that he spent a little longer than necessary in that spot, staring at the titles on the shelf before moving on. About 20 minutes later, he returned to the desk with a single book in his hand. It was old, the spine cracked and faded, haunted places of the Southwest. "Checking this out?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of unease. He nodded but didn't hand it over right away. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Do you know why people say this library feels different?" I shook my head, unsure if I wanted to hear his answer. "Back when this place was built," he began, "there was an accident. A worker fell from the scaffolding on the second floor, broke his neck right where the central staircase is now. They say strange things started happening after that. Lights flickering, footsteps on the second floor when no one's up there. And the books falling? It's always the same section." I stared at him, not sure whether to believe him. "And you think that's what's happening now?" He smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Who's to say? Old buildings hold on to things, memories, energy. Call it what you want. I'm just saying, if you listen closely, this place tells its own story." He checked out the book and left without another word. After he was gone, I tried to brush off the conversation, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling he'd left behind. The library seemed quieter than before, the silence pressing against me like a weight. I glanced toward the nonfiction section where the book had fallen earlier, half expecting to see something or someone lingering there. That night, when I was closing up, I made a point to leave all the lights on. Nothing strange happened during the rest of my shift, but I found myself jumping at every little creak and buzz. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop noticing things I'd always dismissed before. A book falling for no apparent reason, a faint creaking sound from the second floor when no one was there. And sometimes when I was alone at the desk, I'd get the distinct sensation that I wasn't alone. I don't know if there's any truth to what that man said. Maybe he was just someone who enjoyed scaring people, or maybe he'd seen something I hadn't. Either way, I've never quite looked at the library the same way since.